Yeah. All right. My name is Steve Walter. I am the chair of the National Legislation Committee for the California Federation. And I come into this sort of through the back door, as I did throughout my career with the USGS, as I'll talk about here. I'll start back in grad school just to give a perspective about how many left turns I took in finally getting a job with USGS. But let me share my screen here. So I started uh, grad school at the University of Washington back in 1976. Wanted to be an oceanographer ever since I was in high school, probably, and got into the oceanography program there. And here I am on their research vessel heading out to sea for the first time. Uh, Had a lot more hair back then. In the end, though, I ended up doing near shore oceanography in the mouth of the Columbia River, where lots of sediment comes down uh, from the Cascade volcanoes and dumped offshore. And the problem is the sediment gets in the way of shipping, big ships coming up the river to Portland to offload their materials. And so the Corps of Engineers has been constantly dredging this shipping channel for years and years and wanted to understand the sedimentary system. And so they got a project going at the University of Washington where we would sample the sediments across the estuary. And this was an instrument I designed and built while I was there. And for 2 years, we went out and sampled in mostly decent weather. You really couldn't be out on the estuary if it was too stormy. But it was a fun time. Learned a lot. Ended up understanding a lot about the mineralogy of the sediments of the Columbia, which is what ended up being my thesis. But about the time I was finishing up my thesis, Mount St. Helens erupted, and I got much more interested in volcanoes and earthquakes, and got hired on at the geophysics program to monitor earthquakes on Mount St. Helens for about a year until I finished my degree and moved on and ended up in California on another volcano. This one is in Northern California, Medicine Lake volcano, east of Mount Shasta. And here is a Little Glass Mountain. It's just a big obsidian flow. Uh, and I was there monitoring, recording earthquakes underneath the Medicine Lake volcano and later Mount Shasta, looking for evidence of magma chambers under each one of them. All of this is a result of St. Helens eruption and the USGS realizing that they really didn't understand the dynamics of the volcanoes on the West Coast. And that was a temporary job, summer job, but the following year they hired me to come down and monitor earthquakes under the Northern California volcanoes, Shasta, Lassen, and Medicine Lake. And I was there at an interesting time of transition, which is kind of shown here by the change in the logo. When I started, we were Department of Interior Geological Survey with the old pick and hammer logo. And in the 90s, transitioned to Science for a Changing World. And a lot of things changed, including how we recorded earthquakes. When I started, it was pretty much like this, a very analog technology, recording on film or on paper, as it had been done for 100 years. But in the 80s in Menlo Park, some of the seismologists realized that computers were the future, and they figured out how to transition to digital seismology, recording, detecting and recording earthquakes and timing earthquakes all on computer, which speeded things up and made a lot of the processing that I'd been doing kind of irrelevant. In the process, I learned GIS, Geographic Information System, which is basically computer mapping, and put together some of the first map earthquake publications for California. This was a seismicity map of San Francisco San Jose quads that published in 1998 and shows 30 years worth of earthquakes that the USGS had detected and located. And it defines not only the Loma Prieta segment, which is on the south side there with the big beach balls, but the Calaveras Fault, the Hayward Fault, and a couple unknown faults that we really hadn't appreciated until they ruptured back in, well, when was that? Mid 80s, I think it was. Anyway, it was fun putting together these maps. I did another one for the geysers geothermal area and learned that all earthquakes are not natural. This is geysers, a couple different views of it, geysers geothermal area, and almost all of these earthquakes are man-made, caused by the injection. Well, the geysers geothermal area is a source of electricity for San Francisco. There's a lot of geothermal power plants that have been sited there since the early 1970s. And we could see in the top panel there that back in 70, 75, there were only a few earthquakes because there was only one or two geothermal plants. But as the plants started being added, the earthquakes started increasing. And it's very clear that the earthquakes were related to the injection of the water that condensed after the steam was withdrawn and used to generate electricity. That was much of the 90s was dealing with mapping. And then I got promoted into administration, and it was about the time to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Great San Francisco earthquake. So I got the assignment to help put together a manual, a useful manual to anyone who lives in the Bay Area for how to prepare for that next big earthquake, which at the time we and still think will be on the Hayward Fault. So this publication took about a year to put together and has become the #1 publication of USGS in terms of the number printed and distributed. We have distributed over 3.5 million of these publications, mostly in the 5 years following the 1906 centennial. And then I took a 3-month break and filled in for a woman who was on maternity leave back in Washington, D.C. She was a USGS volcanologist on assignment to the USAID for their disaster assistance program. So whenever there was a big earthquake or eruption around the world that involved USAID's disaster response team, she would either be there on the ground helping out and interpreting what was happening, or as I was, doing it from Washington, just staying on top of the seismicity and the eruptions. And it was interesting, while I was there, the office was almost empty. And I thought, well, where are these people? Well, this was 2010. And in February, there'd been that big earthquake, 7.5, I believe, in Haiti. That killed upwards of 300,000 people died in that earthquake, one of the most devastating earthquakes in the last century. And USAID folks were there all summer long and actually for the following few years. So it's just an example of how USAID works with other government agencies to respond to disasters around the world. And it's a shame that USAID is no more, because who is there to respond to these events now? While I was there, it was Labor Day weekend. I had the day off, so I took a walk down to the mall, and a beautiful late summer day, hot, muggy, humid, and stumbled upon this group that was identifying themselves as the Tea Party and were there to protest the federal government. Particularly, they were incensed by Obamacare, which had just passed. But they had a bunch of gripes about the federal government overreaching. And it's turned out that the Tea Party is morphed into the MAGA movement, and we're confronting the results of that populist movement even now. But there I was, seeing the incipient growth of it and recognizing that something was happening, but having no clue what it would lead to. So I continued on, wandered down to the tidal basin, the Jefferson Memorial, and discovered a memorial to FDR that I had not even known about, hadn't even known it existed. So monument to FDR and the New Deal primarily. And there was one quote that I took a picture of that I think is something we need to ponder now. This is from FDR. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And it seems to me this is the question we need to be asking this month and asking of our congressmen who are attempting to ram through a budget that would give, what is it, $4 trillion in tax cuts, mostly to the wealthy. And in doing so, cutting back on the federal workforce, cutting back on Medicare and Medicaid and other government programs. The pendulum has swung, I would say, in the last 80 years from the New Deal to the MAGA movement. And it's not made the country better as far as I can tell. Back in California, well, actually back in Menlo Park, I got, in the last couple of years of my career with USGS, I got assigned to install a couple seismic networks, not in California, but one in Illinois, central Illinois, and the other in southeast Kansas. And in both cases, it would be looking for induced seismicity. In the Illinois case, it was a ethanol production facility by Archer, that was operated by Archer Daniels Midland, ADM. And they were turning corn into ethanol that was used in gasoline. In the process, though, they produced an awful lot of CO2 in that fermentation process that otherwise would have been released into the atmosphere. But they developed a CO2 sequestration project that would pump this CO2 down into the earth, but in the process generating earthquakes. And so I put up a seismic network there to get us handle on the background seismicity before the pumping began. And it continued even after I quit the survey, after I retired. And they have in fact seen a very close correlation to injection of the CO2 and small earthquakes so far at depth in central Illinois. This is my last day on the job. Cleaned out my office, closing the door, and heading off into what I thought would be retirement and all sorts of fun and travel. But instead, I made the, I won't say mistake, but made the choice to join NARFE, the local chapter in Redwood City, where I was asked to take an officer's position, which in this case was just the legislative contact, the CDL, if you will, for the chapter. And that led to an offer to go to Washington that following spring for the LegCon convention, where we get trained on how to interact with Congress folks. So I said, sure, I'd love to go back to Washington, and met the current president of the Federation, Dee Schallenberger, and her husband, Ed, who were there, and the current, at the time, chair of the National Legislation Committee, George Ramirez. All of them there taking the LegCon training. And at the time, Dick Thyssen, this is Dick in the white hair, was president of NARFE and wanted to meet with Nancy Pelosi to talk about the postal bill, which was the #1 priority at the time. And he thought he'd have a little more weight with the California representative if he brought along a couple people from California, even though neither George nor I were in her district. Just being from California got me in the door, and I got to see and meet Nancy Pelosi, which was kind of a thrill. Also got to meet two of the former Federation presidents. Lee Zajac and his wife Helen both served as president of Federation back in the early 2000s. And that was neat getting to know them. And George at the time was thinking of running for president of the Federation. Um, there was a bit of a back and forth between Lee and George, and Lee decided he needed to run again. He didn't want George to win. So um, in the election that summer at the Reno convention, this was 2017, the last time we met in Reno, Lee was nominated and elected president of the Federation and served for the next 2 years. And George decided he didn't want to, he had some health issues as well, but he decided to step down as the chair of the legislative committee and asked me if I'd be interested in serving. And at that point, I said, sure. Couldn't be that much work, right? But it turned out, California has 52 congressional districts. Red in the Central Valley and in the mountains, and blue along the coast primarily. And the idea is we want to have representation, NARFE representation in each and every office, which is impossible because if you look at where our chapters are, there's large parts of the state where we just don't have members. And in some of the cases where we do have chapters, we don't have members who are interested in serving as CDLs. So as a result, if you look at this is a little out of date here, but if you look at the Congress critters in a number of cases, there is no CDL associated. Those positions remain vacant, and it's a challenge to try and find people who can represent NARFE's legislative goals in the representative's office. But we persist and do as best we can, and have had some success this last, just 3 months ago. You remember Joe Biden signed into law the WEP GPO repeal, which had been the number one, a goal of NARFE ever since that law was passed back in the 80s under Ronald Reagan. We finally got WEP GPO eliminated, and that's benefited a number of our members who now can claim Social Security either directly based on their earnings or as spousal benefits from their spouse. So this was a high point of, I'd say, of NARFE's legislative efforts to get WEP GPO repealed. However, 2 months later, we were out on the streets demonstrating because with a new administration with goals of reducing the federal government, we were all of a sudden facing terminations of hundreds of thousands of federal employees. And so we put together a demonstration in San Francisco. And here we have 3 of the officers from the Federation, Ron Griffin, Jerry, and Ron's wife, Sandy, all out there demonstrating against the cuts to the federal workforce. And again, in May 1st, this is the hands off. Yeah, this is the hands off rally in San Francisco where I got to speak and protest the terminations of so many federal employees. And the point I made then, and I continue to make, is that the justifications for these layoffs is spurious, that the assumption is that the government is too bloated and we need to cut it back. Well, this chart proves that at least in terms of federal employees, is not the case. If you look down here, you can see from 1955 up till the middle of the teens when the data stops, the federal workforce has been pretty much flat, around 1.8 to 2 million employees. Other aspects of government have increased. Local and county employees have more than quadrupled in that time, and even the state employment has doubled to tripled in that time, but federal workers, not so much. A couple blips here when Medicare was introduced back in the 60s, a slight decrease in the 90s when Clinton's reinventing government reduced the workforce by about 400,000. So All these layoffs are happening and being justified by a lie, basically. And just final slide here to reinforce the point. If you look in detail at just the federal workforce and look back to, let's say, 1940, coming out of the Depression, the federal workforce was really small, bumped up a lot to accommodate the role of the government during World War II, and fell back again after the war ended. And then it's been up and down around 2 million ever since. And the threat is that if the administration is able to achieve its goals of cutting the federal workforce by 50%, which is what they've stated is their goal, we will be back at a level that we haven't seen since the end of the Depression. And how we manage a country that's more than doubled in population in that time, with a budget that's more than quadrupled, with half of the workforce, it just doesn't make sense. So that's my experience and what I've been up to and what we will be up to in the next couple months, maybe for the next couple years, depending on how things go. It's a battle that is currently being fought and will be fought for the foreseeable future. Anyway, that's it. Any questions you'll have to ask Jerry or Pauline.